Saber mais sobre o nosso passado pode ajudar-nos a perceber melhor o presente e a construir o futuro. Essa é pelo menos uma das motivações de quem se dedica à pesquisa dos seus antepassados, como é o caso de Devin Meireles, com quem conversamos recentemente. Neste dia dedicado à família, conheça as histórias interessantes que este luso-canadiano tem para contar. Devin dedica-se ao estudo de genealogia há mais de 10 anos. É muito interessante. Veja agora.
So let's start from the beginning. How and when did you get interested in your ancestries?
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me on, Teresa. So my interest in family history began about 2010. It was the early 20s. And I always, obviously growing up Portuguese Canadian, I was always involved in the community, attending events with my parents or whatnot. But it didn't dawn on me till my 20s that I realized, you know what, I only identify as an Azorean Portuguese Canadian, but I've never had a real interest in the history or the motivation of what brought the Portuguese people to Canada. Like, why am I here? So that's where it started from there. I decided to look into it a little further. And from there, it started for myself. What do I know about my immediate household? What do I know about my mom and dad? My mother emigrated to Canada in the 80s. However, my father was born in Canada. He is a first generation Canadian. So it was my grandfather that came over, which I thought was quite interesting because all my aunts and uncles on that side, my paternal side, were born and raised in Portugal. My father's the exception of that family. So when they reunited in Canada, he's the Canadian baby of the family. So it started
your parents' ancestries, I mean, they have to come from some country, England, maybe?
No, they're both Portuguese.
They're both Portuguese. Okay.
Yeah. So my mother came from São Roque, next to Ponta Delgado in Azores.
Yes.
And my father's the Canadian baby of the family, but my paternal grandparents are from the Azores as well. My who's from Ginete on the west side, and my was from Faial da Terra on the east side. So I thought that was interesting, just to look into that.
They met in Canada. They met in Canada, but your parents' family was there for a longer time. That's it.
So my parents met in Canada. Yes, my mother came over to Canada. My grandparents, they were established in Azores in the 40s.
Okay.
My grandfather left his family. So he had 3 children at the time, my aunt and my 2 uncles. He left them on the island to establish a life in Canada. They didn't have enough money to come all in one shot, so he came by himself. He was one of the pioneers. 1958, he came over. Worked hard. He started on the railroads in British Columbia. And then once he saved up enough money, he decided, for whatever reason, Toronto would be a good place to establish themselves. So he made the move to Toronto and called over for the rest of the family to meet them over here. Then after that, they reunited. About 10 months later, that's when my father was born. So that's their story, how my father came to be. Yeah, so I thought it was, it started in my 20s and my interest, like I know that, but I want to dig deep. I want to dig a little deeper and find out more about it. What was his motivation to come here? What was it like growing up in Portugal at the time? And them being new immigrants in Canada, what was their experience like in the 60s in Canada, being new additions to the nation, right? So yeah, my interest started from there. I started with just the family tree that I knew, my immediate household, my siblings, and my grandparents. And that's as far as I got. That's all I knew. And my aunts and uncles.
Yeah, that's good already.
But then I said, I want to know more. Like, what are my grandparents' stories? Or their stories above that, my great-grandparents. I didn't know my bisavô. What are their names? What are their dates? Where did they come from, right? So that's when I started interviewing. So, for any novice genealogist or family historian, start with what you know, as I did. Build with, building blocks. You need some clues, some leads as to where you're gonna take off from there. And then from there, I used my eldest living relatives to gather more information from them. So that's when I started doing interviews and asking, okay, who are my bisavô in Portugal? Do you know their dates? Do you know baptismal dates, death dates, anything like that? And that's when you start documenting. And then essentially from there, you build profile sheets of each ancestor on your family tree. And until you extend as much information as you can from those interviews from your living relatives. And that's your best building block to start with when you get into this.
I imagine it requires a lot of patience, a lot of time, but also money, right? Is it expensive to do this kind of research?
So to begin, I didn't spend any money for my first few years. And yes, Teresa, you're right. It does take a lot of time and a lot of patience. You're going to be very eager. You want to find out as much as you can initially. But even with the interviews, one thing I discovered was you're relying on memory of your relatives to come back to you with some information. So in that moment, they might not remember certain aspects. It might come to them at a later time, or little tidbits of pieces of information that tie into your relatives, right? So over many years, it was like, oh yeah, by the way, this story happened, or oh, I remember this one scenario when my father was at Kensington Market, and I was like, oh, you didn't tell me that initially in the interview. So it sort of comes up, you know, throughout time. But to start with, I didn't spend any money. I was just doing interviews, relying on my living relatives, and with the information they were providing me, there's lots of free resources online that you can dig deeper into this. So like the archives in Azores, or Portuguese archives, there's lots of online resources and databases that you could simply search names and dates, and you could find.
Technology helps.
Oh, big time. Big time. That's a major support. And before you spend any money on these ancestry websites or MyHeritage or whatever, start with resources you have on hand that will save you a lot. Because one thing I'll tell you about those websites, they all don't have everything you're looking for. You really got to be selective with the website you're going to go into, but you really want to like reach that point where, oh, I don't have any more information from the resources I have on hand, whether it be online databases or your relatives, before you spend money. That's really big advice.
But do you have to invest some money if you want to take it to the next level?
Yes, you do. Yeah. So I'd say the next level is once you start, find a website where there's whatever your heritage is. We're talking about Portuguese here. So you want to find a website where there's lots of Portuguese users that upload their family trees on there, or there's Portuguese information as well, archives. So spend your money smart.
Could you name some?
Well, there's one website that helped me big time, actually. They focus on European archives. They don't have commercials here in North America like you see the Ancestry websites, or commercials rather. But it's called geneal.net.
Yeah, I know that one.
NEALL.net. And they focus on Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, English archives. They rely on users uploading that information, and there are records and documents you could find in there. So Genial, I did a membership once I extended my resources, and they took me to the next level, that I started finding leads to my third great grandparents, my fourth, and I started discovering interesting little pieces of information relating to my ancestry. So that was a big resource, very specific.
And that one you already have to pay something if you are.
You do have to pay for that one, yeah.
Is it expensive?
I think it was a couple of years ago. It runs about 60 euros a year. But
it's affordable.
I was doing this on a budget initially. So the way I got around it, they give you a 3-day trial for every new account. So I have about 3 or 4 emails that.
That's a good strategy.
Of what I was looking for, I would really focus on that branch of my ancestry. I would make a new account with a different email, and I would spend those 3 days really going in and really researching that aspect of my family tree.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What about DNA testing? Does it help as well?
Absolutely. DNA testing, there's a multitude of advantages with your research. So I did the DNA testing with Ancestry as well. The benefit of DNA testing is you'll find connections. So DNA genetics will link you with other users that have done the test that fits the mold of your DNA composite, and it'll give you suggestions that, hey, by the way, this user might be your second cousin. So then you build a connection with that person, and when you sign up on those websites, your family trees are accessible across the board. So when you get that suggestion, so-and-so user might be your second cousin, you can actually look at their family tree, find them on their family tree, and then you might find some similarities with your family. And then, they might have a bit more information, or your great uncle that you weren't aware of, that was your great grandfather's other kid that you had no idea. You build a link with that. Like you can really discover a lot with the DNA, including DNA research as well.
Mhm. Very interesting. So one of the things you told us prior to this interview is that you like this kind of research, and because your main goal is to inspire people to find out more about themselves, right? I think that was it, what you said. So
Absolutely.
what would you say that it was like the most surprising thing you found out about yourself?
Well, I found a deeper connection to my roots. Like I said, prior to my 20s, I didn't really recognize the struggle that my family, the hardship they faced coming to Canada. You kind of take it for granted. So once you get more insight into that, I formed a deeper connection in myself that, okay, like this is what my ancestors faced to get to me. So it's a profound experience to really find out, oh, like, I'm a grandson of so and so that fought in the army, served, lived by himself for a year and a half, and all this hardship that really you probably don't, you take for granted
Yeah,
otherwise.
it brings
Um,
more meaning.
yeah, a deeper meaning, absolutely. And another piece too for me, I will add, is just better health choices. Once you know more about your ancestors, and with that DNA inclusion as well, find out some commonalities across the board. Like maybe your grandparents had diabetes, or they might be prone to breast cancer, or whatever it is, and you find things that, okay, you can make better health choices down the line as well. So those are two big things that were highlighted along the way in my research. And the research continues, Teresa. I'll say, like,
It's a
as much,
never-ending process, I imagine.
it's never ending. Absolutely. Even 10 years in, how far I got my tree and the information I found out, and I'm writing a book about my grandfather. The research continues. It's endless. It just keeps going both ways. I'll say you look back towards your ancestors and you want to find out more about them. But looking towards the future, we're creating history every day. And with our descendants of ours and the lives we live, we're adding to that history every day as well. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, you talked about the health advantage, which is quite interesting. Did you personally discover something that helped you in that sense?
Um, Thankfully, I'm of good health as of this interview. But diabetes was one. I found diabetes and asthma in my family. So just making better health choices with that. I'm just very conscious,
Okay.
my blood sugar levels and whatnot. But
Yeah.
nothing like really predominant, luckily, on my family. But I imagine for other researchers, and once you start mixing different cultures, people that have different ancestry lineage, that would be very helpful for you to find out
Yeah.
more about yourself. Yeah.
I would say that it's the practical side of this research. You have the poetic one where you find out about stories and stuff, and then you have a more pragmatic part. Still about the DNA platforms that exist. Could you also name some for our
Yeah, well, obviously the biggest one's ancestry.com.ca. They have the largest amount of users. And on the poetic side, like you said, there's a lot of family trees and links. Like you'll be surprised at how many connections you can find on Ancestry. Just myself alone, it's dozens among dozens. And it goes further reaching. It's not just like your immediate family, it's your second, third cousins, your fourth great uncle. It's very impressive with the results you find.
But they also give you that opportunity of making DNA tests, or
They do, yeah. So they'll send you the kit online, whatever it costs. The tube system, so you spit in a little cylinder, you mail it in, and you get the results in a couple weeks. Another option would be myheritage.com. They're not as expansive as Ancestry, but there are a lot of good resources and a lot of users on that website as well. And then if you're interested in the health component and you want to find out, I guess, sorry, I'm tripping up here. I guess your health statistics, 23andme.com is a good website. They'll give you a rundown of what you might be prone to, what your DNA genetics composite works around, and what historically was a common theme in your family lineage that has happened.
Okay. So would you say that this interest in origins, in knowing our ancestries, do you see lots of people having it, or is it still something quite specific that only some people are doing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do feel like it's still a niche market, like it's a very selective group that really get into this. But at the same time, I do feel like there is an increasing interest among society with Ancestry and website and commercials being out there. But you see a lot of like shows coming out now as well that are highlighting ancestry or family history. Like Who Do You Think You Are on TLC. There's Genealogy Roadshow. There's Long Lost Family. So there's these different shows that highlight it as well. I think in the future, it will grow in popularity. Once people recognize the benefits, as we discussed, the poetic side and the pragmatic side of finding out a deeper sense of who you are, and just incorporating that with health choices. I think once you discover those pieces of yourself or your family history, that can change the way we live and the decisions we make in our day-to-day lives. So I do see it becoming more popular down the pipeline. And I do see the interest growing a bit, but it's still very much a niche market. Yes.
Okay. Maybe the pandemic helped, no? People have more time to think about this kind of things. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, do you notice this?
Or a lot of family trees will be growing post-pandemic as people...
It's also a possibility. Specifically regarding the Portuguese community in Canada, which you know, do you think there's an interest in knowing the Portuguese origins and an interest in the Portuguese identity in general?
I think it's very select few within the Portuguese community that are really tuned in or tapped into this interest. Same thing as I said in general, like I think it's very much a niche market. I don't think it's a very common piece. A lot of, I grew up in a Portuguese community as well, and I know a lot of Portuguese Canadians. I do find a lot of people in my generation just recognize that, oh yeah, I'm Portuguese, my family's from Azores. But it's very baseline information. When you ask them like, oh, where did your grandfather come from or what year, they're not really in tune with that aspect of their own family history. But I think it is something undervalued in the Portuguese community now.
Okay, so you wouldn't say that they are proud of their Portuguese origin? They're maybe indifferent.
I do definitely feel a sense of pride with being Portuguese.
Really? Why? Why would you say that they're proud?
I think it's just something to highlight. It very baseline. It's a connection you feel. Like at this point, we're all Canadians. I'm a Canadian myself. So once you sort of assimilate to the Canadian way of life, and it is what it is, it's a funny, interesting little tidbit to say, oh yeah, my family came from Portugal,
Okay.
my mother came from whatever, Spain or whatever, right? But beyond that, really generating that interest to like dig deeper, I think it's very surface level. So I do feel a sense of pride that there is some clout with that comes with that. Like, well, I'm not just Canadian, I'm Portuguese and my family's from Azores. But what does that mean? And can you tell me stories about that? That's like a little foreign to everybody. It's like, oh, I don't know. They came from Portugal. That's all I know, right?
Okay, so you would say that you're an exception. Your interest is exceptional.
I guess in that sense, there aren't many Portuguese family historians that I know. I'm sure there's groups out there, but there are a few people that I have interacted with, but on a grander level, I haven't really felt that sense of community among Portuguese family historians. So that's down the pipeline. I would like to inspire more Portuguese Canadians to really dig deeper and find out more about yourselves, because there's a lot of interesting stuff, and that deeper connection you'll build in yourself will really, it's a profound experience.
So I imagine that with all of your experience, you somehow got a different perception on the Portuguese identity. So how would you describe it?
Yeah, as a Portuguese identity, being a Canadian, I think it's undervalued of the hardship that the ancestors had faced and what it took to get us to Canada, or as Portuguese, what the hardship that was faced in the country itself. I think there is a piece of the Portuguese society that sort of just keeps moving forward, like the sempre frente attitude. We don't look back. And in retrospect, you don't really explore those details beyond that. I think we're a hardworking people. We faced a lot of hardship and a lot of stuff we've overcome. But I don't think it's very, mind you, there are books I've discovered along my research that really delve into it. But is it like household names that we're familiar with, or household knowledge that we just openly talk about? I think not so much. So I think in that sense, it's a little undervalued of how hard Portuguese people are and what we face.
When you say that, are you referring to Portuguese that live in Portugal that are not aware of the difficulties that the immigrants community face?
In the sense of a Canadian Portuguese.
Okay. So the perception of Canadian Portuguese people in that sense. Okay.
Yeah, that's how I feel.
Regarding the perception of Portuguese people that are still in Portugal, do you have any idea of what's their perception on their opinion regarding the Portuguese communities in Canada? Is it good?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't really thought about that in
It's
detail.
difficult.
It is difficult. But Portuguese, the nation itself has overcome a lot since the revolution. They've become very democratic. They're very free-thinking people. So I think they've come a long way in that sense. Whereas before, a lot of people were leaving, as the pioneers and my grandparents, and a lot of people were leaving the country for better opportunities. Since then, are there as many people leaving Portugal? I don't think so as much. So I think, yeah, in that sense, that's as much as I could say about that.
Yeah, I'm asking because I think sometimes the Portuguese people, I live in Portugal, so this interests me particularly. They are not quite aware of the strength of the Portuguese communities living abroad, namely Canada. That's
okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. And in that sense too, that is an inspiration for myself, where there were strength in numbers when these communities came over to North America or wherever they immigrated to. But now in this current generation, you do see the Portuguese communities locally sort of dissipating a little bit. There is a sense where it's like the elders that are really steering the cultural communities and really putting together these festivals. But you don't see a lot of activity among the youth, like people my age or younger. I'm 1988, but I don't see a lot of like millennials or Generation Zs getting involved. So you kind of get a sense of concern that, oh, if it wasn't for these elders, this would just be non-existent.
Yeah, and what will happen after, right? What will happen in the future?
Yeah, like what's the Portuguese community in Toronto going to look like 10 years from now? Who's going to be steering the ship? And and so I think that's a piece of my inspiration as well. It's like I feel the sense of urgency that someone needs to step up to the plate. Who's going to take on these cultural clubs and the parades that, you know, to me as a kid, I took for granted. I didn't really have an interest. So it was more Canadian than Portuguese. But now as an adult, it's like, you know, I'd like for future generations to get that exposure. But how are we going to keep this going, right? So to your point, Teresa, that does resonate, that I do see Portuguese communities on the mainland or on the islands in Portugal, sort of undervaluing the Portuguese communities abroad because they're not as strong, I guess.
Yeah, makes sense. So Devin, my last question is, what kind of advices would you leave to people that would like to know a bit more about their ancestries?
Yeah, I mean, if any piece of you is interested in your family history, ask questions. Just start with yourself, your immediate household, build that family tree. As we alluded to earlier, like it takes a lot of time and patience, but as you discover stuff along the way, document it. Write down anything, any tidbits, any stories, and you'll experience how things keep building on one another, and it's just a snowball effect. As you collect more, it gets bigger and bigger. But be curious, ask questions, and write things down as you go along the way. And you know, within a decade or as the years go by, it's a profound experience when you realize, oh, like these little things that I took for granted, I didn't write down in the moment. When you actually do write it down, you have something to go back on. It's a deeper connection you can build in yourself, and for the future generations, your grandkids, your children themselves. Because if it isn't for us in this moment right now, where's all that information? Where's that history going to go? So we got to do our best to document it and keep this Portuguese culture strong, and our sense, our identity to our homeland. Keep that strong.
Okay. Can people reach out to you somehow? I'm not sure if you're still lecturing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I could do teaching sessions online on Zoom. Post-pandemic, I would love to do live sessions as well. If you have any questions, I'm happy to help. I'm not a professional genealogist. I just do this for myself and my own family, but I'd love to share tips and pointers to aspiring family historians. So you can find me on Instagram. That's my outlet. I do share some of my findings on my account as well. My account is at Meireles History, Meireles History. And there you can shoot me a personal message, find some of the information I share, and I would love to inspire or help those interested in this topic as well. So I'm there.
Okay, thank you so much, Devin. I hope to see you again, and good luck with your researches. Thank you.